Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today it is Season 1, Episode 31, The Gentleman from America, starring Biff McGuire as Howard Latimer. And this is a perfectly acceptable and entertaining episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It's a little bit different than most episodes that have been seen up to this point, and the pacing, I think, might be a little bit off in a few places, and the ending feels a little rushed. But overall, I feel like this is an entertaining episode, especially if you like those old classic ghost stories. So we start in May of 1940, and we're introduced to two men, Stephen and Derek, and they are important characters. And it turns out they're waiting for results from a race. They need some money, and they wind up not winning. But a man named Latimer does win, and it's hinted at that this guy has a lot of money. He doesn't really need any more. So Stephen and Derek introduce themselves to Latimer, and they chat for a few minutes. We get to know each man, and eventually they get around to talking about a Hurstwood ghost, which is a ghost that supposedly haunts a house of some of Stephen's relatives. And Stephen also mentions that his family can't see it, which I thought was kind of odd. But Latimer doesn't believe in any of this story. He's just not having it. So eventually they make a wager for quite a bit of money that Latimer can't spend the entire night there. And it seems like Latimer's just kind of bored, honestly, and he wants something to do. So he agrees to do this. So they go to the house in the next scene after our setup. Pretty typical setup for a man in a ghost house episode. And it turns out he has to stay all night. He can't leave before 6 a.m. the next morning or he'll lose the bet. And the other rules are that he only gets one candle in one match, which will be important later on. And also at this point, Stephen gives Latimer a gun, and Latimer's very reluctant to take it. But after firing a shot, not very accurately either, Latimer agrees to keep the gun, and Stephen and Derek think this is a wise move. They act like he'll need it. So they go to another room, and they're still chatting. And Stephen basically points out to Latimer a book on the history of the ghost, the story, and Latimer's still not buying it. He doesn't even seem that interested in reading it, but we'll find out that he really is. Very soon here. So eventually Stephen and Derek leave, and Latimer decides he is going to read this ghost story, and this was his first mistake, I have to say. So the story is pretty typical. It's basically two young girls wind up by circumstance to be alone in this house while waiting for their father to return, I believe. And their names are Julia and Geraldine, and they're in bed and they hear noises. And one of the girls, Julia, investigates. Of course, we all know this is always a mistake in these kind of settings. And it turns out that Julia doesn't come back, at least not the same way. Geraldine sees her body, I guess, and it's deceased, basically, and Geraldine goes crazy from this. And it turns out that the story goes that a lunatic escaped from some nearby sanitarium, and that's how all this tragedy took place. And I have to say that while this is a very typical and not very creative or original ghost story, I did think the scenes with the girls were very well done, and they build up the creepy atmosphere, so I approve of that for sure. But Latimer's still doubting at this point. He's like, yeah, right, the typical kind of nonsense, But at this point, Latimer actually sees the ghost, and I have to say it's pretty obvious this isn't a real ghost. It looks really, really fake and really, really bad, even for what would be a real ghost in a 1950s TV show. So we as an audience pretty much think it's a trip. I do think that's kind of a minor flaw in the episode. But Latimer's definitely buying it. The ghost is getting closer and closer to him, and he decides he is going to use the gun, and he shoots, but the ghost keeps coming, and Latimer passes out. I actually thought he was dead at first, but it turns out he just passed out. He survives this. So then, kind of in a bizarre twist, we go 5 years in the present to 1945, and Stephen and Derek are talking about the house. They're still friends, still hanging out together, I guess, and they talk about, we don't know whatever happened to that guy Latimer. This is when we find out that he passed out, but that he survived. So then Latimer just comes back to the house, and I have to say this felt kind of rushed. He just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and the other two men were talking to him, and all of a sudden we find out that this was a made-up story. Basically, the whole thing was staged so that Stephen and Derek could win the bet. And we learned that they made up the ghost. Basically, the gun had blanks in it. They weren't real bullets. That's why it didn't work. And they made up the whole story about the two girls. So at this point, Latimer just goes completely crazy. He attacks Stephen and calls him a murderer. He says, "You're the one who did it." And at this point, some men come in and they grab Latimer and they take him away. And it turns out that Latimer had gone crazy and he escaped from the sanitarium. And he was trying to get back into that house to find out who killed his sister Julia. So I would say Latimer's not doing too well. And probably a lesson for Stephen and Derek here not to stage these kind of things because you never know what'll happen. But like I said, an entertaining episode overall, even if it has some issues. And I give The Gentleman from America a 3 out of 5. Definitely an episode to watch once, especially if you like the old classic style ghost stories. So 3 out of 5 for The Gentleman from America. And as always, thank you very much for watching.